will be having a very exciting guest that Scott Allard is going to introduce for us.
That's it. Wow, that's great.
Yes,
Thank you. Thanks, Peter. So thanks to CSD and Evans for kind of pulling this together quickly. Just before I introduce our speaker today, a few reminders. For those of you who are on the webinar, please submit questions through Q&A. We'll have time at the end. Richard invites questions from the audience while he's speaking. So feel free to raise your hand and ask both clarifying questions and maybe even more provocative, thoughtful questions. So Richard Reeves is a senior fellow in economic studies at the Brookings Institution, where he holds the John C. and Nancy D. Whitehead Chair and leads the Boys and Men Project. He has a BA from Oxford University and a PhD from Warwick University. As you will tell, his research focuses on boys, men, inequality, and social mobility. The book, which he'll be presenting from today, of Boys and Men, Why the Modern Male is Struggling and Why It Matters and What to Do About It, has been well received and received some accolades, as was his prominent 2017 book, Dream Hoarders, How the American Upper Middle Class is Leaving Everyone Else in the Dust, Why That is a Problem and What to Do About It. There's some common kind of.
I only have one subtitle.
It's good. It's good. It's good. He's a contributor to the Atlantic, National Affairs, Democracy Journal, Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times. He sits on a number of academic boards and centers. In a prior professional life, he was the director of Demos, London-based political think tank, a principal policy advisor to the Minister of Welfare Reform in the UK, social affairs editor of the Observer, and an economics correspondent for The Guardian. So a lot of rich experience that comes together in his work, both today and prior. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce Richard Reeves.
Thank you. I'm going to try and do this sitting down, if that's okay. So if anyone's online, I hope let us know if you can hear me okay, but I'd rather this became kind of conversational at a certain point. I do have some slides to share with some data. I suspect you're the kind of audience that appreciates a good chart. And as a Brookings scholar, I obviously have to have charts with me. I get I get a lot of anxiety if I don't have PowerPoint with charts on it, especially in economic studies. When my wife asks me, "How was your day?" I say, "I don't know, median, mean, be more specific." If you follow me on Twitter, you wouldn't have to ask. So I do have some slides, but just a way of motivating this work around boys and men before I kind of get into it in some of more detail is that it does build on my previous work on class and race and the intersections that I'm seeing between gender, class, and race. And also some of the failures, I think, to engage with this subject of what's happening to boys and men in a way that I think is productive and is policy oriented. So that's what led me to this unusual topic, a topic that in some ways I was surprised to land on as well. And so with that, I'll give an introduction, but Scott said, please, like, if you don't like something I've said, or you don't get it, or you disagree with it, just put your hand up. We can have a brief discussion. If I don't get through all my slides, it's fine. I really just want to make this a session that's as useful to all of you as possible. And I look forward to learning also from you, just in terms of your responses to it. So this I've written this book on boys and men, and let's see if this works. What do I do? Is there like a trick for this? If not, I'll have to wait for it.
Thank you, Scott.
Nice to see. No,
It's just weird. I think the keyboard works. I can always play the keyboard over here. All right. So I don't have slides. But there you go. There's lots of slides. All right.
How do I go back?
All right. I got it.
You got it?
It's working? Yeah.
All right.
I'll go back. Look. So here's look at that. There's been a few books on boys and men already. Hannah Rosen had this book about 10 years ago, The End of Men, based on an Atlantic article that she wrote. This is Kay Heimowitz, this is Phil Lombardo, this is Andrew Yarrow, Brookings Press, where my book's from. Warren Farrell, John Gray, Boy Crisis, books on boys and men. Right, there are plenty of them. So, like, why another one? Why this one? Well, all scholarship is at least partly autobiographical. All scholarship is at least partly autobiographical. It's just a question whether we admit it to ourselves or not. And in this case, it's kind of easy because I have 3 sons. So I've been worrying about boys for 27 years. All my boys are now in their 20s. I've raised them in the UK and the US. So I'm seeing some of the just the questions that they're facing, which are different to the ones I faced, and certainly different to the ones my father faced growing up. So that's part of it. So I need to put them on the table immediately. But of course, these are not kind of the boys. This is a long time ago, by the way. I should say they're in their 20s now. I use this one because I used to be taller than them. But as I kind of, in my day job at the Brookings Institution, I'm looking at trends around employment, class, poverty, inequality, family life, etc. I just ran a big project on the middle class. So it's important to note that the only reason that American middle class families saw any income growth at all in the last few decades was because of women's earnings and employment. You know, men on net were a bit of a drag on middle class incomes. So like if we hadn't had those massive changes in women's economic fortunes, then we wouldn't have seen even the relatively modest growth we saw in middle class incomes. So it was one of the sort of breadcrumbs that led me to it. And I just kept running across these data sets that I sort of knew that there were some inequalities that were running the other way, but I didn't know quite how big some of them had gotten. And I also thought that they weren't getting either enough attention or perhaps the right kind of attention. And by that, what I mean is that too often the debate about sex and gender was being framed in a zero-sum way. Okay. Somehow, it'd be a bit like saying to a parent who has a son and a daughter, they're only allowed to care about one of them, right? Whereas actually, in a lot of these cases, I think we do need to worry in different ways about different groups, especially, as I say, when we intersect by race and class. So I knew, for example, that there'd been a huge change in the gender gap in degrees over time. So this is showing you the number of women per 100 men that are getting bachelor's degrees and then master's degrees back to 1972. 72 is a good year because we have decent data to lend, but it's also when Title IX was passed to try and close the gaps for women and men. And as you can see the trend since then. And there's actually now a slightly wider gap on this basis anyway than there was in 1972. This is the other way around. And it's interesting, and you can see it's kind of leveled out more recently. So the big changes was in the 70s and the 80s, but there's been a great overtaking essentially. And again, these are relative figures. This is important. I'm going to mix absolutes and relatives, so I'm just putting hands above the table there. And you might reasonably wonder whether this matters, why that's a problem. If it is a problem, after all, the labor market works differently for men and women, etc. But nonetheless, I didn't know that it was bigger today than in 72. I didn't know. I knew that there was a gap in high school. I didn't know that if you rank GPA by decile, high school GPA by decile, which is what I do here, the 2/3 of the top decile were girls and 2/3 of the bottom decile were boys. I knew there was a gap. Didn't realize the gradient was quite as strong as the one we see here. There's not such a big gap in standardized tests, of course, but there's a very big gap in GPA, as you can see here. And so what that means is that some of the policy decisions that institutions might make, for example, around going test optional, are certainly not gender neutral. The evidence suggests that going test optional in college admissions increases the share of women at the college by about 4 percentage points, which, again, good, bad, not making a point about that. I'm just saying that if you start to weight GPA more heavily, that's obviously going to affect your college admissions. So that's going to affect that. I'll skip that one. One of the reasons why I think this is happening is in education, I got a little bit into some of the very dangerous area of neuroscience, right? If you want to lose friends quickly, start talking about brains. And especially differences between male and female brains, right? That's a great way to ruin a dinner party. And actually, I'm pretty clear in my mind that like end result differences in male-female brains just aren't that big or important. I just don't, I don't get it, and people get excited about it. But the timing of brain development is very different. So what this shows you, this is Larry Steinberg's work. If you don't know his work on adolescence, I strongly recommend it, because it shows you that adolescence is a period of equal brain plasticity to early years, but doesn't get anything like the same attention. And what they've done here is they've shown for girls on the left and boys on the right, using a measure. It doesn't start at 0, hands above the table. And there's two things going on here. So you can see impulse control is the blue line. So that's the brake in the car. And then sensation seeking is the gas. This is a great idea. Let's jump off that. Let's take that drug. Let's sleep with that person, whatever it is. And the impulse control is maybe not. So they like to use that analogy of gas and brake. And you can see that adolescence is a period where like the balance between impulse control and sensation seeking changes, and there's kind of more sensation seeking versus impulse control, but there's also a massive gender gap. And you can see that kind of the difference between impulse control and sensation seeking is kind of very different for boys. And that's partly associated with the fact that the prefrontal cortex just develops a little bit later in boys than girls. Girls hit puberty earlier, the prefrontal cortex develops a little bit earlier. And I'm not a neuroscientist, but I think of the prefrontal cortex as a bit of your brain that has you turn in your chemistry homework. It's the bit of your brain that remembers you have chemistry homework, takes the chemistry homework, takes it home, does it, takes it back, turns it in, remembers you have a chemistry class to go to. And so if you develop that earlier, those organizational skills, it's not cognitive, it's non-cognitive functioning skills, the CEO of the brain type stuff. And there it just seems like that develops just earlier in girls, and the men kind of catch up, but it takes a while. I think one of the other problems that we should be addressing is what's happening in the gender balance in education. And so you can see here what's happening. This is just cross-sectional, how many men and women we have at different levels of education. I don't show the trend here, but the trend in elementary and especially in high school has been fewer and fewer men. And so we are seeing fewer male teachers, especially in K-12 education. And I think that's an issue. One of the reasons I'm here is because Washington State is considering a commission to create a boys and men commission. It would be the first state in the US to do that, to complement the existing women's commission that was created in 2018. We'll see if it happens or not, but it's very interesting. And one of the things that they're really focused on is, why don't we have more men in what I call the HEAL professions: health, education, administration, and literacy? Or put differently, why is it that we are watching the numbers shift so strongly for those professions to become female professions when they didn't used to be as strongly female, and not at least pause and ask ourselves if that's okay? Maybe it is okay. Maybe in the end, it doesn't matter if all our K-12 teachers are women. But maybe it does matter. I don't know. I think it does matter for reasons we might get into. The other, so that's education. And then in terms of work, so actually, let me stop there, because that's a kind of good point before I move on to employment. Anything I've said, not said, that anyone's reacting to, feel free. Please weigh in. Yes.
Like 1,000 questions.
Okay, let's start with one.
But I'll start with one. Could you talk about the NEET rate for
What rate?
the NEET rate, not in education or training?
Yeah.
And how that's changed over time?
Yeah. A little bit. I mean, I don't want to be held to any of these numbers because I don't know the data well enough, but it's gone up. It's a little bit higher for, this is 18 to 24, right? So not in employment, educational training between 18 and 24. I think it's a little bit higher for males than females, but not much. But if you really dig in, what I'm much more interested in is why and what else you might be doing. Because you might not be in education, employment, or training, but raising a kid. And it turns out that a lot more of the female needs are mum, our parents, with a child in there than the men. And that seems to me to be a different kind of issue. It's not that it's not a problem, potentially, but it's not as if, it's not as if they're not doing anything, or it's not as if it's a mystery to us what they're doing. One of the problems with male needs is that we just don't know what they're doing. Whereas we know what quite a lot, and people in the room who know this data better than me, please pipe in. But a lot more of the female needs are mums. So it's a different kind of issue. Yeah.
Do you want to comment at some point, it could be later, about the difference in the types of fields that boys and males study in school compared to women? That seems as
Do you mean post-secondary? You're talking about college and university?
Yeah, but that gets prepared for in the at the K-12 level. Math taking and all that, math and science taking.
I wasn't planning to, so if you have a question about it, now would be a good time to ask.
But we could save it for the discussion.
Okay. I am struck, however, that because there's been just this huge catching up, that even in subjects where I really expect to still see quite a strong bias towards men, like math and statistics and physical sciences and so on, they're just not quite parity, but they're close to parity. I think math and statistics is pretty close to parity now in post-secondary. But of course, parity is not the same when you don't have overall parity. Right, so if you're 60-40 female male, but you're only 45% female math, then it's still an underrepresentation by comparison to the overall share. So, but I was quite surprised to see, and of course, in professional subjects like law and medicine and pre-med and stuff, we're at or beyond parity now.
Physical sciences, computer science, I thought math as well, the last time I looked.
Math is 44% female now at post-secondary.
Bachelor's degrees.
Yeah. Yeah, engineering's doing better. The really big lags are actually tech. And that's true at an occupational level as well as at an undergraduate and graduate level. It's like tech tech's in worse shape now in terms of gender diversity than it was 10 years ago. Actually gone backwards in terms of women into those things. So that's a really interesting trend. Engineering's trending up, still, nowhere near parity for engineering, but trending up slowly, tech going slightly the wrong way. And those are the two outliers. Most, if you take science as an overall category, then most scientists in the US now are female.
Really, biological science is very strongly.
But the problem is that, as always, so much depends on how you're defining it, and some definitions of science include social science.
I think because there's more female teachers in primary school and secondary school, is it that boys as students, are they less likely to see a female teacher as a role model, at the school, just because, students are spending 8 hours a day or a lot of time in school, so is that?
Yeah, well, it's important to note that the elementary numbers haven't changed that much. Like, it's always been about only 1 in 10 elementary school teachers have been male. It's dropped a little bit, but most of the drop has actually been, I wish I had the trend chart here now, but most of the drop has actually been at high school. It's still 40% male in high school now, and 28% in middle, but the drop has been much bigger there. So it's pretty stable lower down. The question is, like, why does that matter? And I should say I don't have early years on here, but it's kind of stupid to do early years because it's like 2 or 3% male. And in fact, as a share of the profession, there are only half as many men teaching kindergarten as there are women flying US military planes. We have more female fighter, twice as many female fighter pilots as male kindergarten teachers. To be clear, I'm all about female fighter pilots. In fact, if I'm being really honest, I just want whoever's best at shooting down the enemy planes, flying our fighter pilots, and a lot of those turn out to be women. Great. We've redesigned the planes, and that's great. But I think I'm going to go out on a limb here and say, from a social welfare perspective, it's more important to get men into our kindergarten classes than it is women into our fighter planes. Both are important. But so kindergarten, now why does it matter? It might matter because you have to see it to be it. So I don't want education to be seen as a feminine thing. I don't want boys to grow up with the idea that it's women's work. And I think that in ways it's hard to measure. I think that just sort of seeing men is important. Male teachers judge male behavior a bit differently to female teachers on average. They're a little bit less likely to say something's a behavioral problem. Male teachers are more likely to be coaches, which we could discuss. And in particular subjects, there's quite good evidence, I think, that having a male teacher helps boys in particular, like English. It looks like having an English teacher is good for boys. A male English teacher is good for boys and neutral for girls. Interestingly, in STEM subjects, the historical evidence is the other way around. So ideally you want female STEM teachers and male English and humanities teachers, because it looks like the evidence is that to the extent those are subjects where it goes a bit against the grain, it would be better. But the subject that men are least likely to teach is English. So it's not just we don't have enough men, we don't have them in the right subjects either. So I'm all about encouraging more men, and I actually call for male-only scholarships to get men into areas where there are not enough men teaching, including early years and English, especially in middle school. Yeah.
Wondered if you could talk a little bit about your conceptualization of gender.
Oh, what, sorry?
Your conceptualization of gender. So
Yep.
you're using the term gender, but you so far have sounded like you're referring more to sex. And I wonder how non-binary gender overlays on this, and how you would think about, like, are these differences you're observing more about gender roles? Are they more about sex at birth? And how do you think
Yeah,
about
that's
that?
fair. So what I try to do, and you're right, I'm being loose in my terminology, I try when I can to use the terminology that's used in the data source that was used to collect the data. And so like something like this, for example, it's based on survey data where the teachers themselves are asked to assign themselves. And increasingly, of course, they get third options or more options than that now. And historically, there hasn't been that case. So we have forced people into that binary. So that's most of the data I'm drawing on will use that. But you're right that in most of the data I'm referring to, sex would be the more accurate term, because that's usually the term that was used in the survey to get the data. As for how far it will start to change as we see more people identifying outside of that. The honest answer is I don't know. Right now, we still have the majority of people who self-identify into one of those two categories. And so I think those concepts remain useful. Will they still? I find, for example, it is still useful to measure what's called the gender pay gap. I suspect wrongly, because actually it's based on earnings data that's about sex, not gender. But anyway, the headline term for it is a gender pay gap. And I still think it's useful to measure that and take like people who are, attributed female in the labor force data and say what's their median earnings, and then the same with male, and see what our progress is. There might come a point where we don't think that's useful anymore because we've got past those binaries. But I think my own view is that we're a long way from that point. And then if you add other intersections like race, I think it becomes even more important, because if we don't at least have some data on, say, sex, it's really hard to see the very different trajectories for, say, Black boys and Black girls, which are astonishingly different along a lot of these measures. And I don't want to lose that nuance just at this point. At the same time, recognizing there are going to be increasing numbers of people who aren't in there. We should look at them too, but without, in other words, I don't think we have to choose. I think we can do both. Yeah, you had your hand.
Are these all numbers from the US?
Yes, everything I'm going to give you is US unless I say otherwise, but the trends are similar in most other countries.
Kind of address the question. There was a question in the chat that said, would you address what of these trends are particular to the US or shared with the UK or EU countries?
The UK is pretty this is an issue pretty much everywhere. I don't know if I've got the other HEAL professions. I hope I do, but it's not just true in teaching, it's true in other professions as well. It's the gender desegregation of the labour market has been mostly one way. It's been increasing numbers of women in what were previously male professions. Not all of them by any means, but a number. But if anything, the trend has been the other way in terms of the occupations that are more female dominated. There's actually fewer men in those professions than there was 40 years ago. And that seems to be an international trend. Certainly the education stuff is international. Yes, any more? Let me do a couple of things on work. All right, I like this. This is the kernel density distribution of the male and female wage distribution in 1979. Blue male, orange female, full-time workers, prime age or 16, sorry, I put 16. Anyway, it'll come to me. So in 1979, 13% of women earned more than the median man. Look at those two wage distributions, right? This is the kind of thing that should start a movement, and it did. And this is what happened. And you can see extraordinary progress. 40% of women now earn more than the median man. At the same time, look how flat it got, pushed out to the right. And so with the class gap has widened very significantly over those same decades as well, with very, very rapidly rising earnings top of the distribution. This is part of my previous work for both men and women, and some catch up in terms of the wage distributions. They're not the same. 40% is not 50%, obviously, but it's a lot higher than 13%. This is really extraordinary progress. I mean, I just think we sometimes don't. I think just even though there are many things still to do, we should also just kind of recognize how much progress we've made in the last 40, 50 years, certainly in my lifetime. But this just underlines the point. If you look at wages at different points of distribution, so here's a little bit messy, but the hatched ones are women and the non-hatched ones are men. And what I'm showing here is the 20th percentile, 50th percentile, and 80th percentile. So what you're just seeing, we're based back at 0. So I've just indexed it back to 0 at 79. 79 is when we have decent data series from, as many of you know, and you could just sort of see what's happened. And so a number of things have happened. Like one is women's wages have gone up. Very great. That's what you'd hope for. Men's wages have not, by and large, except at the top. The middle and the bottom, they've been a bit stagnant, but they've all fanned out. And you can see that just like the most dramatic wage growth has been at the top. And so you can see like men at the top, which is the 80th percentile, that blue one in there, they're tucked in kind of among the middle. So they've done about the same as women at the bottom, but overall it's just seen this huge increase in wage dispersion. If you then get household formation based along those, you get massive household income inequality, because if the high earning women end up with the high earning men, you get massive household inequality. And that is one of the main drivers of economic inequality, has been the way we form our households with basically rich women and rich men ending up together and vice versa. Also, coming back to this point about the need to be intersectional, same data series 79 to 2020, weekly earnings in dollars, obviously adjusted for inflation. Blue dot 79, orange arrow 2020 earnings, and obviously they're all going up. Standout white men still well above everybody else. I mean, it's almost like a slight, little bit separate bracket, gone up a bit. But then you can see like what are the big changes too. You can just see like really very, very strong wage growth for white. I should say this is the median. Huge growth for white women who used to be a little bit ahead of black women. They're now quite a long way ahead of black women, and they're quite a long way ahead of black men. So for every dollar earned by a white woman, a black man earns about 84 cents now. Now, I'm showing this chart partly just because I think it's incredibly important we continue to look at this intersection. You can look at a gender gap, you can look at a race gap, you can look at a class gap, but I just think it's incredibly important to be able to look at all of them together and in different ways through different methods. And I think the story about the very, very strong growth in wages for white women is a very important thing to bear in mind, and that now how much more they earn, say, than black men. Questions, comments? Okay, I have got heel jobs. So I call these heel jobs as a kind of deliberate contrast to STEM. Everyone knows what STEM is. Actually, originally it was SMET, and then Judith Ramilly in the National Science Foundation. She inherited, she was told that one of her jobs was to encourage SMET. She said, I'm not doing that. She said, I'm going to change it to STEM. She did, and the rest is history. And there's been a huge push to get more women into STEM. I actually talk about HEAL, Health, Education, Administration, Literacy. I define that in the book and some papers I'm doing. And here are just some examples of that. This is not the whole occupational category, but I've already mentioned elementary school teachers, psychologists, social workers, and nurses. Slight uptick in number of men in nursing, but it's very modest, and a big fall in all the others. And what really strikes me about this is that actually you go back, and psychology and social work didn't used to be all that high. I mean, they were pretty equal. But look now. And if you look at psychology as a profession generally, it's dropped from 39% male to 29% male the last 10 years. Among the small number of psychologists under 30, only 5% are male. So it's very interesting. People see these as kind of gendered professions. And here I think I am using the term correctly, gendered professions. It's like, well, they didn't used to be as gendered. How did they become so gendered? And are we okay with them? I'm not. And I don't want to see those lines keep going that way, because I need a therapist. When I needed a therapist, I wanted a man. When my middle son needed a therapist, I wanted him to go to see a man. Maybe that's not true for everybody, but I'd like the option. Same in care homes, etc. I think a diversity of providers is not a bad thing. And so I don't look at those numbers and feel comfortable with them. Other people might. Yes.
The title of the slide says not enough men in
Yes.
heel jobs. What would be enough?
That's a great question. How about 40%?
So where does that number come from? I mean, is there research suggesting?
No, I'd say, so it depends why we're answering the question. No, one way to answer it is, I would like all occupations to have sufficient balance of men and women that it doesn't seem odd to want to go in it, even if you're in the minority. And there it looks like 30% is kind of an important-ish number, right? Because if you're saying to someone, do you want to be the one female engineer out of 100? That's a tough ask. Being one of 330 out of 100 seems to be, and vice versa. So there's a kind of like, I have this sort of, there's a little bit of evidence for this, but I'm not going to overstate it, but just like, there's a point at which occupations become harder to enter because they don't seem as being for someone like me, including around sex and gender. So that's one. Number two is just, I'd like there to be enough diversity provision in different settings, such that if it's helpful to have, like a woman carer deal with a woman, take her to the bathroom or whatever it is, or then there are sufficient available. Same the other way around too. So for me, that's why I get to at least kind of 30 or 40. The other thing I'm drawing on is some evidence from Rong Su and James Round, some psychologists who looked at where men and women are in terms of the overlapping distribution of their interest in people versus things. One of the things you'll hear is men are a bit more into things, women are a bit more into people. That's true at the average, but the distributions massively overlap and is in no way determinative. And they look at the personality profiles of men and women and then say, okay, if we assume that those personality profiles are correct and there is this slight difference, what would be the occupational distributions? And what they find is about 30% of engineers would be women and about 30% of nurses would be men. Now, it's not 50%. And so what they're saying is, look, we don't think that it's gonna get to exactly 50 unless you decided for social engineering reasons that would be important, which, by the way, I think we should for politicians. But you're very uncomfortable with 5% or 3%, because you know that doesn't represent anything like the actual distribution of preferences, personality types among men and women. So the problem is you get stuck between two debates. One is until everything is absolutely 50-50, then everything's socialized and we're still living under conditions of sexism. But the other is, of course, we don't have women engineers. Their brains don't work that way. And of course, we don't have male nurses. They don't like you. And that's not true either. And so many of our problems stem from the inability to comprehend overlapping distributions that are different but overlapping. Yes, I'm going to go here first just because yeah.
I've noticed that on that graph, the only trending upwards line is registered nurses.
Yeah.
Do you think that example could be a model for getting other men into heel jobs, or do you think that's more relation to it being STEM adjacent?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. One is that nursing has become better paid and men are a bit more pay sensitive. You can get into why, whether that's a good or bad thing, but they are. You can make pretty decent living now as a registered nurse, especially as a nurse practitioner. So I think that's relevant, whereas K-12 teachers haven't had a real pay rise for 20 years. And by comparison to their level of education, pretty poorly paid. So I think that's one factor. Number two, and this is a bit harder to prove, but important, which is a non-trivial share of the men in US nursing now are immigrants and come from countries where it's not so gendered. So a lot, for example, and don't quote me on this, but quite a few, I think, men from West Africa, for example. And so it's not necessarily kind of US born men that are going to nursing. To some extent, we're feeling it's men coming in from outside. So, and that suggests to me that we've got a long way to go in terms of helping to persuade American men that nursing is a career for them. It seems like in other countries where it's not so gendered, we're bringing some of those men.
So I have an alternative story from your graph, and I wonder what you think of it. So when I look at this graph, what I see is 3 of the 4 professions were always female dominated, or always is a bit of an exaggeration, but actually, like, for instance, social work is a profession that was started by rich white women who were being kept out of, who didn't have opportunities to go into other fields. Yeah. So these were always, not only were these always female dominated, but they were female dominated because women were being kept out of other parts of the labor market. So if that's the case, then and psychology is an interesting one to include in there, because psychology sort of developed in competition with social work and was a place that men were able for longer to keep women out of the field. So if that's the story, then the thing we should be concerned about here, I think, that is what you're saying we should be concerned about, is the reduction in men in these fields. And beyond the kind of sort of diversity argument that we want both men and women in the fields, why is it that, what is the sort of qualitative reason why we should be concerned about this going up and down a bit when they were always female dominated fields? Because not by women's choices, but because of being excluded.
Yeah. So I mean, you're right. And of course, if we go back even further, that was true of teaching. I think in the 50s, something like half of women with a college degree were teachers. In fact, it's really the only reason that women were going to college was to become teachers, and there weren't really many other career options for them. So I agree that to some extent that was forced upon women. And of course, these are relative shares. And so, you know, a much higher share of women today are not teachers in the labour market than used to be, because the women are now doing all the other jobs as well. So why do we care? Well, first of all, they weren't, I mean, it seems to me there's a different, even if you don't buy my magic 30 idea, there's still quite a big difference between 40% and 20%, right? in terms of the freedom of choice that people have to go into that profession. If part of your goal here, which is mine, is to just maximize occupational choice for everybody, then I'm automatically nervous about any professions where you drop below a certain share of any characteristic. I'm just focusing on sex here, because I just think it's harder for people to go into that. We've just put a barrier in their place. We've made it harder for, so if only 15% of engineers are women, it's just harder for women to get into engineering. It just is. And so that's one reason. It's a restriction and occupational choice as a result of the norms around occupational norms. The second one is the one you mentioned about provision. Is there evidence that it's beneficial to have more of a diversity of providers on that dimension? I think there is in some areas. I'm convinced by the education story. Don't know about social work. I only have anecdotal evidence on psychology. I can't prove that it would be better to have more male psychologists. So I agree that that's just an intuition. But the other thing is, I think trends matter in the sense that it's one thing to look at a level and say, how do I feel about that level? It's going to slightly depend on what the trend is. So I'm not satisfied with the share of women in engineering, for example, but at least the trend's the right way. Now, I want to push it further, but the line's going the right way, whereas these lines are going, in my view, quotes the wrong way. And so it's partly about, like, at what point would we start to care? And do we hit a tipping point where it gets harder to arrest it? So once 80% K-12 teachers are women, 99% of early years educators are women, I think it'll get even harder to then arrest course if we think it matters. So you're right. I have to persuade you that it matters in order to persuade you they care about this, because I worry you hit a tipping point where you just made life much harder for yourself. Like, I think it's harder to persuade men to be social workers when only 20% of men are social, 20% of social workers are men, than when 40% are. And I want more male social workers. Yeah.
So my question is, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the concept of the glass escalator concept, where even men and some of the work was done in nursing, in the nursing field, where the few men in that profession are, occupying roles that have better, income or position. So, what do you say about that? There may be more women in these professions, but the men that are in this female dominated roles or professions are actually in roles that are important. And then I want to push on, I'm from Ethiopia, and can we really generalize the trends that you see here for the sub-Saharan African region or in Asia? So I think that's important, right? Like, that is going to be consequential. This conversation is going to be consequential to the effort that's being done to improve with girls' education and access, so if we can speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, right. Well, I'll do the second one first, because I think it's crucial that we have to be able to think two thoughts at once. That's a big theme of the work generally, and to say that there are many parts of the world where it would be sort of insane to talk about gender inequality in a way that isn't just about women. But there are some parts of the world where it's not, where some of the trends that I've just shown apply. And so what that means is I don't think we can have a single view about gender equality that applies equally to every country in the world. But we could until relatively recently. Now, I'm not saying that the US in 1970 was the same as Ethiopia in 1970. But I am saying that since about that period, as a result of the success of the women's movement, the position of women relative to men has been very significantly transformed in many countries in the world, but not all. And so I think we have to be able to hold that thought. The trouble is that people then feel like somehow that means letting up on the continued efforts in those countries for women and girls, because here we're in a different place. That somehow pointing out that the single biggest risk factor for dropping out of college in the US now is being male, controlling for everything else. There's a big issue, I would say, for men in post-secondary education in the US. How does that apply to the situation in Afghanistan? And the answer is it doesn't at all. And so it's a challenge. The glass escalator thing, I think it depends why we see that glass escalator effect. So that's the effect, I'm understanding how you're framing correctly. Men go into female-dominated professions, but then they end up in more senior positions in those female-dominated professions. They end up as principals or running wards. I think it depends why. What's going on there? What's the dynamic within that profession that's allowing that to happen? And I don't have a very good answer to that. I know the trend is real. But I will put out one thought that is, if you have an occupation that is quite strongly gender skewed, it may be there's a bit of a selection effect going on. Like my son's a educator, early years educator, and he has to really want to be an early years educator as a guy. Like he really has, you have to be really passionate about it, a real mission, because you have to go against a lot of stigma and barriers to do it. And so it may well be, and the same would be true the other way around too, is that you're just going to get kind of someone who's a little bit selected into being more exceptional or more talented, maybe because they're going against the grain.
Does that argument work for women as well? Like women getting into early.
Correct. It should, if that's right, then it would work the other way around. If, however, it's something about the way that the occupation is structured, or all occupations are structured to, say, for example, penalize those who take time out to care. And if those people taking time out to care are disproportionately women, then you're going to see the reemergence of some of those gaps, even in those professions. They might not be as big as the gaps in other professions, because you'd hope that more female-dominated professions would have dealt with, have better institutions to deal with that, but you still might see it. So to the extent that this is about a parenting gap, then you might see it reemerge in those professions. All right. What else have I got? Oh, this is just the wrong Sue James Rounds paper that I referred to earlier, where they looked at what's the actual, it's a little bit out of date, but the actual share of women in these different occupations, which is the blue line, and then they predicted what the share would be if people were choosing their professions based on their assessment of personality differences between men and women. So what you can see is that they think, look, we think that 30% of engineers would be more like it. So what they're basically saying is, if we had 30% of engineers with women, we might be persuaded that that's because everything else equal, a few more men are interested in engineering than women. Other end, health medical services includes nursing. We'd expect it to be only 60% as opposed to what it is now. So what they're basically saying is, the labour market is much more segregated by sex than it should be, even if we accept the fact there are some differences on average between men and women in their preferences. I find that very convincing. And a nice balance between the view that men and women should do different jobs because their brains are different, and the view that we're all entirely the same and everything should be 50-50 under conditions of free choice, which seems to me to be unrealistic. What it should do about family. This is just really reiterating something. Now I'm going to 70 because I've better different data sources just to prove, just to make the point. So I've got women who earn more than their spouses if they're dual earners, about just below 30%. Women who are more educated than their spouses. Now, on average, women in most marriages now, the one woman is a bit more educated than the man, which you'd expect given the trends. Households where woman is the primary or sole earner. A lot of those are single earners, but not all, so 40%. And then labour force participation of women under age 6. So you can see back in the 70s, most women with children under 6 didn't work. Now the majority do. So this is just a way to show the scale of the change that's been achieved by what I would argue is economically the biggest liberation in human history in advanced economies. This gets a bit to the question about what's happening with the pay gap. And what I really like about this, and this is actually, I think it's Danish data. I need to update it because there is now a US study which I can share with people. What I really like about this is that it uses the fact that we now have much more data on same-sex couples. And so you can use the data on same-sex couples to look at the impact of taking time out of the labour market to care for a child. And so what you can see Oh, no, sorry, this is not that one. I'm sorry. This is the wrong. I do have another one that shows that. It's the same for same-sex couples. What this shows you is women, children, not children, men, children, not children on the right. So what is it kind of showing you is that when men have children, look what happens to their earnings trajectory. Nothing on the right. When women have children, look what happens to their earnings trajectory on the left. But it's really up to that point of having the first child when you do it. But as I was mentioning, there is some data too now that does it for same-sex couples. And what's interesting is you see a similar pattern. But in the case of a same-sex couple, very often it's mostly women, because it's women same-sex couples are much more likely to have children than male same-sex couples. Actually, there is the opportunity to take it in turns to be the birth parent. And so over the course of the relationship, it kind of evens out. Whereas in a heterosexual couple, what happens is that the birth parent is the mom and she gets hit again and again in terms of her labor market earnings. But it's nonetheless instructive that what's happening in same-sex couples with the first child is very similar to this. I could show you the chart and it would be very similar, which is great data because it allows us to start teasing apart how much the pay gap is about a parenting gap. And it turns out a lot of it is now a parenting gap. Yes.
So the graphs differ.
Yes.
In chart, and why is that in regards to the y-axis? Because from what you can see in chart A, when seeing earnings relative to event time, females without kids actually earn about 3 or even approaching 4, while on B it seems to fall a little below 2.
Good question. I have to ask them. This just makes the point that there's been a huge increase in the share of births outside marriage. Again, a massive change, which I think needs to rethink what it means to be parents, that the idea of co-residence and marriage is just, I think, not the way to think about the relationships between parents and kids. And so, but also it makes the important point that there's a gigantic class gap in that as well. So this shows you 1990, 2019, and 2016, the share of births to mums who are not married by education. Now, of course, the composition of this education groups is changing in size quite significantly. The big composition effect here as well. But nonetheless, you can see that it's doubled among those with the BA, but it's still pretty low. Overwhelming majority of women with a 4-year degree will have their child within a marriage. There didn't used to be much of a marriage gradient. There's now a huge marriage gradient. And I think it's an important fact about US social history that the women with the most economic power are the ones who are most likely to get and stay married, which is not what the women's movement predicted. They predicted the opposite. And so I just think it's really important we kind of understand that, which is like what's going on in terms of the revealed preference for very economically powerful women to have their children within marriage. But I think it's because they're co-parenting, they're investing in human capital, etc. It's not for the old reason of marriage, which was largely about economic dependency. Okay, I'll do one slide on solutions and then we're done. All right, what should we do? Let's start boys in school a year later because their brains are slower to develop. Let's have 1,000 new technical high schools because technical high schools are great for boys. They're neutral for girls, but they're great for boys. Let's do that. More apprenticeships. Already talked about males. I would have some subsidies. I would subsidize men into those healed professions. I think it's time for some financial incentives. It really was necessary to kind of break some of the glass ceilings for women into STEM. I think we need to do the same for men in the heal. Equal independent paid leave for mothers and fathers. Just yesterday, the US military announced that non-birthing parents were going to get 3 months paid leave. Mostly fathers, of course, but not all. 3 months equal to the birthing parent. How about civilians? What does the military know that we don't know? What they know is that dads matter as well as mums, so they're each going to get 3 months, and same-sex couples also get 3 months. And then I would say something about the unmarried. Our legal system for those who are not married is not great. Marriage, the divorce courts work pretty well. It's a bit of a mess if you're not married. And given how many kids are now born outside marriage, we have to update our legal system for a world where we cannot assume marriage to be the norm, especially for those who are less well educated. Oh, a bit of blatant self-promotion. Yeah.
So I thank you for your book. I listened to it and it felt really poetic because I was running kids to basketball practice and folding laundry to hear about this and the narrative you build. I actually had a question about the policy suggestions and kind of a 2-part question. So some would argue the future is not targeted policy. If the Supreme Court strikes down affirmative action and we continue to contest around different groups and who gets what. So that's kind of a broad question in terms of like the trade-offs of, and you speak to this to some extent in part 4 of your book, but like subsidies for HEAL for all people versus boys, or high schools for everyone, or so I'm interested to hear more of your thoughts on that. But then kind of the related question is, in part 4, it seems like you're speaking about federal policymaking environment, but I'm wondering, what are the trade-offs if states run with your ideas? And does anything that you've thought about have to be federal, or could these be state level policies?
So you're right that, so first of all, it's rich in policy solutions because I want people to argue about policy. And it makes me very happy when people say that's not the best way to help boys. Here's a better idea. Great. And because I didn't want to have the chapter 11 problem, Yasha Munn calls it the chapter 11 problem. You have 10 chapters explaining in great detail how we're all going to hell in a handcart. And then your publisher says, well, that's a bit gloomy. You need a solutions chapter. So it's a rainy Tuesday night, you throw together a solutions chapter. And so you knock something out that says we need universal pre-K apprenticeships and national service. I'm being a bit unfair, but I wanted to really go into the policies, right? And I wanted productive policy conversations. So did that. Do they need to be targeted? Not targeted in the sense of like, I mean, some of them are, like the red shirting one. I think in practice, much more likely will just be more developmentally appropriate about when we start schools, and that will happen to be more boys, which is what's happening. But like technical high schools, they're not going to be for boys. It's just that the evidence suggests that they're particularly effective for boys. In the same way that student debt cancellation is not aimed at women. It's just that it will really help women because they own 2/3 of student debt. And that might be a factor in the way you think about it. So it's not in the sense of like targeted by and large. Now, the exceptions are things like the incentives for HEAL, etc., where I am absolutely modeling it on the scholarships and incentives that exist to get women into STEM, right? And into previously male professions, which have been quite successful at trying to just, like I'm enough of an economist to just think sometimes money really helps. So that is targeted. Maybe we won't need any of those targeted policies in the future. Great, but to the extent that there are some differences in learning styles, say between boys and girls, we're probably going to have some to make sure that we're being fair to both. I deliberately don't necessarily aim at a federal level, and in fact, most of these levels are at state level or lower. And as I mentioned at the beginning, the fact that Washington State is considering a boys and men commission, I think what it would look at is look at what's happening in the state. Why are men 80% suicides? Why do Seattle public schools have the second largest gender gap in the US? In English, at least. It's happening. Girls are a grade level ahead in English in Seattle. I just think it'd be good to look at that and understand what's going on. A big part of that is a race story, by the way. Because it's either going to be city or state level, and like the HEAL stuff too, right? I think look at that. Well, there are 4 schools in Washington that teach social workers, psychologists, etc. If we could get them to get interested in scholarships or social marketing and getting more men in, that's much more likely to succeed than at a federal level. So I don't have, if anything, I'm probably biased a little bit more towards the state and local level, and some of it will be school district level. And the thing is, it will vary because policy levels vary by place. So in some places, it'll be school districts. Yeah. Actually, maybe about someone. Yes.
Q&A.
Yeah. Okay.
So Katie asks regarding the red shirt idea. She says it makes sense for little kids, but when they play it forward to a 4-year high school, will everyone be okay with 14-year-old girls in high school at 19-year-old young men? And maybe changes to the American high school system would have to accompany this type of policy solution. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, there are already 19-year-old men in our high schools. They're the ones repeating grades. Last time I looked, and I think the data's a little bit old, but 1 in 4 black men repeat at least one grade before finishing high school. So we do have, right? We do have old men already. I don't know, but I'd want to examine what the concern is and get at it, because I think you could argue the other way around. You could argue that actually a lot of girls might prefer slightly more mature boys in the classes with them. And if there's a developmental gap, developmentally, I'll horribly exaggerate, developmentally, like a 15-year-old girl is like a 16-year-old boy. So do I want 15-year-old girls in classes with 16-year-old boys? Yeah, developmentally, I probably do. So I'd need to know more about what the concern is, but I just start by saying there are 19-year-old boys in our schools already. It's not, that would not be a new thing. There'd obviously be a lot more of them, but I think they'd be doing better. That's my hope, is they'd be doing better. They'd be more attentive. They'd be doing better in class. They'd be less disruptive, etc. Plus, and this may not be a particularly relevant data point, but the average a 10th grade girl is twice as likely to date a boy a grade above her than in her own grade. So to the extent that dating is a revealed preference, a different one for sure, that suggests that there is a maturity gap that exists between chronological and developmental age. I'm going to focus on people who haven't asked a question yet. Yes.
You mentioned earlier about wanting the best fighter pilot. And I think I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but in a previous interview, you had mentioned that after Title IX, we leveled the playing field of competition in schools and we found out that girls were better.
Yeah.
And I think that's a good sign for our labor market, that we have the best and brightest learning and being pushed into more technical professions. But I think you make a good point. What do we do with the men who are now leaving the labor market and not looking for work at all? And so when you get to the solutions, I'm curious, and talked about the level where this would be enforced. How much of this needs to be in homes, and how much of your book is targeted to parents to, at an early age, be encouraging and changing the ideas about what lines of work are suitable for their boys becoming men?
Yeah, I mean, I hope that will be part of the message. I hope part of the message is to just make sure that we are sending that. I recount in the book driving home from a doctor's appointment with one of my kids, he was about 6, and he said, "Dad, I didn't know that men could be doctors." It's like, what? I didn't know that men could be doctors. And it was only then I realized every doctor he'd seen up to that point had been a woman. And he just met his first male doctor. And it was a real moment for us. Like, my God, they really do believe their eyes. Of course he doesn't know that men can be doctors, because he's only ever seen women doctors. I mean, trying to persuade him that men could be teachers, that was the whole thing. So they got, and I said, of course men can be doctors. And nurses. And so I think the mood music around which are occupations that are appropriate is hugely important. But that requires us to get out a little bit of some of the ideas of meritocratic competition. And the ones I'm most worried about are working class boys. And that's where I think some of the norms around what's occupationally appropriate are strongest. That's tough. Okay. Yeah, let's answer that. Yeah, you haven't spoken.
I have a question about methodology. Originally, I wanted to ask you, how do you look at the data and then you give an example of possible policy? How you do that change from data to policy without generalizing extremely? And then you talk about overlapping distributions. Do you think that we need to pay close attention to overlapping distributions when it comes to demographic data or data in general? Like these things that seem like patterns but are not categories, but we can see a tendency. Do you think there's an importance in that when doing demographic policy based on data?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. One is, isn't policymaking just a massive exercise in generalization? But trying to make it as attentive as possible to differences within distributions as well as to overall distributions, I think is the goal. So that's my attempt to answer the first. But here what I've done is I've tried to create as tight an alignment as possible between problem and solution. So if you don't think it's a problem, then you're not going to like the solution. But it is in that sense quite targeted, like take my HEAL subsidy, whatever it is, right? Problem, not enough men in those professions. Solution, subsidy, scholarships, etc. Problem, boys are developmentally behind. Solution, boys start, etc. Try to just make it clear what the line is between problem and solution, because then if it doesn't work, you know it didn't work, and you knew why you were doing it in the first place, rather than just, hey, let's do this and see what happens. Well, we're in the Hans Rosling Center, right? And Factfulness is one of the 2 books that I make every new research assistant read when they come to Brookings. Just love it. And he talks about the importance of overlapping distributions and the dangers of the gap industry. That when you're told there's a gap at the median between X and Y, and look, I'm guilty of it, like, we're all guilty of it. And there's a bit of a tendency sometimes to stress how far distributions overlap when you're trying to minimize the difference and focus on medians when you're trying to stress a difference. And you will notice that that's what I just did. But I think he was right, Rosling was right to say that looking at how far distributions overlap when you're deciding what's an appropriate policy response is incredibly important. There is a very big difference between distributions that overlap very, very tightly between two different groups, where I think then you can back away and say, is there any justification here at all for having differentiation policy? Probably not. But then there are other areas of policy where there are really the distributions are really very different. You know, the impact of earnings, the impact on earnings of having a kid for women and men, right? There's a very different distribution. Crime, very different distributions for men and women. And so there, I think you can start to say, okay, what's the shape of that distribution? How far do they overlap? And try and master the art, and it's art as much as science, of saying, I'm going to frame policy in a way that is attentive to the real differences in the way that these distributions are overlapping without being determinative, without assuming that everyone's going to fall into one of those two buckets. So how can we, the beauty of thinking about overlapping distributions is it gets us away from the idea that everything's the same or everything's different. And I think that is an art that I know I'm still working on, and the policymakers definitely need to have more of, because when you go into the real world and you look at race, you look at education, you start to see the overlaps between the overlaps get more and more complicated, and I think that's instructive to policy. The harder it looks, the more complicated it is, the closer we probably are to getting it.
Nice question to finish up on. It's 1:30, so we will end our formal